All right, guys, welcome back. All right, we got ourselves a little special guest today. All right, Ben, can you say hello? Good. Hi, can you go cheese? Good job. What you want to say to the camera? All right, you go get that and go take it to mommy. Our special guest is about to go do something else. Run, 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 Benny, go. Okay, all right. So this will be our last video until we get to work for the packet. All right, today's focus is going to be on Asia. Now, we talked about India and how it got colonized in the last video. Today's focus is going to be primarily on China and then Japan. Okay, so with China, we're going to go back to before when the class started with the introduction of the Ming Dynasty. So that was a very long and semi-recent dynasty in China, the second to last one. So they were the ones that replaced the Mongols, the ones founded by Genghis Khan. All right. Now we're talking about them for a couple reasons. One, they're going to move the capital of China to Beijing, where it is still today, known as the Forbidden City, due to the banning of all outsiders for a while. The Ming Dynasty is also when you get modernization of the Great Wall. The Great Wall is actually a series of walls scattered about. It's not just one long connected wall. So different ones were built over time, and they built the more modern style that what we know today. Also, I know some of you probably have heard that the Great Wall of China is visible from space. That is a flat lie. If it were as thick as it were long, then yes, it could be seen, but it is as wide as the street between here and my neighbor's house, and it's the same color as the earth around it. So you cannot see it from outer space. That is a myth. You also, way back beginning of the year when we talked about some of the explorers, there's one very famous and probably even more impressive than the ones we talked about, explorer that we hadn't mentioned, named as Shanky. So he is before Columbus, and he is going to sail to the eastern coast of Africa. So he's the first Asian to find a waterway to Africa. So he doesn't go around the continent like Da Gama and Diaz, but he is the first to get there. They're also going to be heavily impacted by the Columbian Exchange. These new goods, especially corn and potatoes, and then fast-growing rice, are going to lead to astronomical increases in population levels throughout not just China but all of Asia. Um, so that's one reason why more people in the world live there than they do anywhere else, even today. Now, that forces them to interact with Europeans. That's why we're kind of talking about them. China has always wanted to stay isolated from the rest of the world. They didn't want anything to do with the Europeans. Okay, even with the Silk Trade, they're kind of hesitant to that. They had everything they needed to support themselves, so they really liked being isolated. Okay, whereas Columbian Exchange, they benefit from these new crops. So it forces them to interact with the Europeans, and the Europeans are not going to want to let go of that. So we will continue to talk about that effect in these notes. Now, after them, all right, is the Qing Dynasty, spelled Qing. It's pronounced Qing. The only reason we're going to talk about them a little more in depth because the main thing they're famous for, they will be the last imperial dynasty of China. Okay, after them, no more dynasty. All right, you get the more modern republic, okay, and that ends in 1912, a few years before World War I begins. So let's talk about this back and forth love affair between Europe and China. So Europe had always wanted the great resources there. I mean, like the whole age of exploration was geared around how do we get to Asia? All right, silk, porcelain, spices, you name it. China is going to limit this trade with the Europeans. Okay, so they eventually do relent and let them start to trade with them, but they were only certain ports that they could go to. Okay, they couldn't just go to anywhere in China. They were told only this location, and there's only certain times of the year. Okay, so it's kind of like a season of trade, not just whenever you want it. Okay, so this is very much in the Chinese favor. There was one European nation that they do actually trade with, unlimited trade, and that will be Russia. All right, that's not because Russia was a better country or anything, but Russia actually shares the northern border with China, or shares China's northern border, and Russia is a lot more Asian than it is European outside of the St. Petersburg, Moscow type area. Okay, so they had a stronger connection with the Chinese. Now, Europeans were, for the most part, content with this, except the British. Okay, the British developed this huge trade deficit between them and China, and so this is back around mercantilism, still the predominant economic theory. So Britain is losing its silver to China. Okay, British merchants are buying Chinese stuff. The Chinese aren't buying anything from us. So Britain is running out of money, and that's going to cause it to become vulnerable in regards to the rest of Europe. So they do not like that. Okay, so the British do one of the most terrible things through history. Okay, to solve this, some of you might be familiar with what's about to happen. They're going to introduce the Chinese people to a drug. This drug is called opium. They do that. They get the Chinese people addicted to opium, all right, in the hopes that they're going to start buying more and more of it. Okay. That way, now the British finally have something that the Chinese do want. All right. So they start buying up this opium, but now you're causing a drug epidemic throughout the country. The British could care less about the humanitarian side of that because now they're evening out this trade imbalance with the Chinese. And that was the whole reason they did that. In response, the Chinese government tries to ban all opium use. All right, and they're going to block off the main port that the Europeans had access to, called Guangzhou. All right, so they block off that port, and then that's going to lead to an outburst, which grows into the Opium War. Now, there's actually more than one Opium War, but the first one, 1839 to 1842. Okay, so war breaks out. It's going to be a very easy British victory. All right, the British are able to kind of seal their win when they're able to sail through, I believe it was the Yellow Sea, or not the Yellow Sea, the Yellow River, but they sailed pretty deep into the Chinese heartland down a river without hardly any opposition, and it makes the Chinese realize we're not defeating the British. Okay, so as a result of the Opium War, you get the Treaty of Nanjing. So a whole war happens between these two countries because one of them wanted to get the other addicted to drugs. Okay, people have been kind of crappy throughout all of history. It's not just a recent thing. So the Treaty of Nanjing, all right, it's going to ease British trade in China. All right, so the British, they don't have the same kind of restrictions that have been placed against the other European countries. There's also going to be absolutely no limit on the opium trade. They can get as many people as they want addicted to it. They can sell it. They can advertise it. However, no restrictions there. And then the British actually get control of a chunk of Chinese land, a little island, all right, off of southern China known as Hong Kong. Now, in class, there's a really neat video we would have watched talking about how the British culture is still evident in Hong Kong today. They don't give back control of Hong Kong until I think it's the 1990s, maybe it's the 80s. Okay, it's fairly recent that Hong Kong had gotten its independence from the British. So they technically get a colony off of Chinese land. So you just now saw Europe gets a little bit of control over part of China. Okay, and we're going to kind of keep seeing the Europeans chip away at that control of this country. All right, and that next step happens about 8 years after the Treaty of Nanjing with the Taiping Rebellion. So this is a peasant revolt in China. This is not the work of any European country. Just these things happen when people feel like they're mistreated. But the Chinese government is unable to squish this revolt, so they call on help from the other European leaders. Well, now they're admitting they need the help of the Europeans. All right, and as a result of that, we're going to start to develop what are known as spheres of influence throughout the country. So the spheres of influence, all they are different regions of China where certain Western countries had kind of exceptional military and economic freedom there. Okay, so they could bring in their own soldiers, even though it's still China. It's not controlled. It's not a colony. Okay, but now they kind of get the freedom to do what they want. It's like if I had at your house a room that I said, hey, I'm going to come. I'm going to bring my stuff over. I'm going to blare loud music if I want. I'm just going to come in and out as I please. Okay, it's not me buying a part of your house. I'm just kind of occupying one section. That's what these spheres of influence are like. So Germany gets a small chunk. France gets down in southeast, all right, including Vietnam. Britain gets the most. Even Russia gets the northern section. But some of these main European powers start to chip away at areas of China and control it of their own. All right, and then in 1899, you have the open door policy. All right, so the United States, now that we're finally getting involved in the this imperialism game, we had just gotten control of the Philippines from Spain. So we're not wanting to get left out. We didn't have any spheres of influence in China. We don't want China to get colonized just like Africa had because then we're going to be completely cut off. Okay. So we try to do something to offer the Chinese a way to give us more control but still stay sovereign. Okay, so the author of the Open Door Policy, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay, one of the more famous ones from American history. You'll learn about him 2 years from now. What the Open Door Policy does is it's going to guarantee equal trade access to China for European nations and the United States. Okay, so China doesn't want us here. But the only other option for China is war is probably going to break out and we're going to start colonizing and actually taking away parts of their land. So China is forced to agree to the open door policy. If you look back at that political cartoon for the other day, you see an Asian student standing in an open door in that classroom. That's what they're referring to. So they really don't want that at all, but if they don't let us come in and trade as we please, we're just going to go in and take them over. Right? So that's what the United States proposes, so that we don't get left out of this international trade with China. Okay. So all this little meddling by European countries is going to lead to the fall of the Qing dynasty. Okay, so that fall begins, all right, about a year later with the Boxer Rebellion. All right, now this is not people who build boxes or in their underwear. The Boxers were a group of militant soldiers. Okay, they were rebels, and what they start doing is they start going across China and starts killing all foreign merchants and Christian missionaries. They're tired of the Europeans coming and changing their ways. They want China to have back control of itself, so they go in and try to slaughter and wipe out these other groups. Okay, so the Chinese are not able to end the Boxer Rebellion, even though it's not their own people getting killed. They know that there's going to be severe pushback from the Europeans, and a coalition is formed by European nations and Japan. We'll talk about why later in this video why Japan is getting involved in China's problems. But the other countries come in and they stop the Boxer Rebellion. So that's twice now Europeans have come in to end a Chinese rebellion. And that's pretty much, look, man, you can't solve your problems. We're going to do whatever we want here. Okay. Well, during that time, the Empress is a woman named Cixi, right? Cixi. So what happens is her nephew had been the emperor, and she overthrows him. And for about the last 50, 40 or so years of the Qing dynasty, she is going to rule. Now, the Chinese people, they were wanting to reform. They were wanting to modernize and catch up with the rest of the world because they've seen what's happened because China refused to modernize. They were so vulnerable to the rest of the European nations. She refuses to do that. Okay, she eventually, at the end of her reign, she tries to instill some of this modernization. These reforms come way too late. Okay, she dies in 1908, and the only heir left is an infant. So you get a little baby emperor. Now this has happened throughout European history. So there's a regent to serve in their place till they're old enough. Baby emperor is not going to get a chance to lead China because 4 years after that, Sun Yat-sen is going to lead a Chinese nationalist movement that will overthrow the Qing dynasty. So Sun Yat-sen is the most important figure in the fall of the Qing dynasty. So he's a nationalist. He wants to westernize China because he wants China to be strong and powerful like the other European countries, like what is happening with Japan at this time, which we hadn't talked about. He also advocated for what was known as the Three People's Principle. So the Three People's Principle, okay, there were three things that he believed that all Chinese should have the right to, kind of like their Bill of Rights. Okay, nationalism. Okay, you all need to try to fight for your country to be number one. You should have democracy, a chance for the people to vote, and then the right to your own livelihood / welfare. Okay, so this is kind of an anti-communist principle. In the 1930s, you had the Kuomintang. Was his party, and they're going to combat the communists, and they will fall. And that leads to the creation of Taiwan. It's an interesting story. But for a while, Sun Yat-sen and his nationalist Three Principles policy is going to lead China. So the Qing dynasty ends in 1912. All right, Sun Yat-sen then is going to replace it and creates a provisional government. So it's not a permanent, it's not the new government. This is just a temporary one until China is able to create something more permanent. To lead this provisional government, he's going to found the Kuomintang Party. All right, that's his political party. They're going to be a fixture in Chinese politics for the next few decades. The problem for Sun Yat-sen is he did not have the support of the military. All right, if you're going to overthrow a government and replace it, you need military support. He did not. The man who did was a general named Yuan Shigai, and I probably mispronounced that, but just bear with me. So originally, Shigai had been hired to defend the Qing dynasty and lead them. Once he sees them crumbling and falling apart, he turns against them and uses that as a chance to seize power. Okay, so and after seeing that Sen creates his provisional government, General Shigai eventually is going to overtake that provisional government and become the official leader of the Republic of China. So it's no longer a Qing dynasty; it is its own government, the Republic of China, a new nation with General Shigai as its leader. All right. So under him, the military is going to lead this new republic. But then after he dies, all right, China kind of falls apart into a civil war. Different generals want to control, um, and no one could really agree on who. So these provinces of China are going to be run by warlords, leading to decades and decades of fighting until the communists eventually seize power from the Kuomintang, right before, right, it was actually right after World War II. But that is the beginning of the Republic of China, and then in 1949, they will become the communist state that we see today. So that is how China goes from a dynasty, though, to a republic temporarily. Well, that's one of the two countries we're going to talk about. The other one now, Japan. Okay, so the culture in Japan is going to evolve, and they're going to be, at first, just like China, they were very hesitant of the European influence, but they actually embrace it and start to change a lot quicker than the Chinese had. But before that happens, okay, the old Japanese government was run by what were known as shoguns. Okay, same name as a very delicious restaurant off of Airport of Mobile. Okay, you'll probably been, but no, the shogun. Okay, so these were military rulers. Okay, and they rule on behalf of the emperor. So they are not the actual leader of Japan. Okay, the emperor was. Okay, and they'd had the emperor since like the 1200s. It had been almost 1,000 years that they'd been under the same government. But the shogun is the one who actually ran the country on their behalf. Think of it like you had the sultans in the Ottoman Empire, but it was the but you had their oh shoot, I forgot the name. But yeah, it's not czar. That's why that's going to frustrate me that I can't remember. But you you had someone who kind of ran the government on behalf of the sultan. So in Japan, you have someone running the government on behalf of the emperor. So this military government was known as a shogunate, but that's kind of how the Japanese government went. Then, starting in the late 1500s, you get a unification movement. Okay, so Japan had been a couple of different little kingdoms or not empires, but little kingdoms kind of scattered throughout its own island nation, and they'd always been at war with each other. Okay, well, they finally, in about an 8-year period, all right, someone starts getting the upper hand, starts defeating the other kingdoms, and then takes over and unifies Japan, similar to what we talked about with Germany and Italy. That leads you until a period that is known as the Great Peace, all right, called Tokugawa rule. It's called that because of the first shogun in that time period, Tokugawa Ieyasu. But that is also when you see the samurai start to decline is during the Great Peace, and Japan moves towards a period of isolation. All right, they try to cut off all ties to other nations and focus solely on them. They also moved the capital of Japan to a place called Edo, which we now know as Tokyo. All right. So that's the old Japanese government. But then in the mid 1400s, okay, Europeans make their way. So if you remember, it was Portugal that, because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, had control of the trade routes to Asia. So it's natural that they're eventually going to make their way to Japan. Well, these Portuguese traders that arrived on the Japanese shores introduced them to new weapons, especially guns. Well, that's how the Japanese unification happens, because they start trading with some of the kingdoms. The wars become one-sided, and it's a lot easier for them to defeat the traditional Japanese armies once they learn how to master the new technology. A few years after the traders, though, arrive, you get missionaries. Okay, so the Jesuits, we talked about them at the end of the Reformation, and how they were famous for going to areas that were considered too dangerous for anyone else. Well, Japan was an area that was considered too dangerous. So the Jesuits go over there to try to spread Christianity, led by Francis Xavier. And they're actually successful in converting up to over 100,000 Japanese to Christianity. Well, that upset the large landowners in Japan, known as the daimyo. All right, and about 8 years after the Jesuit arrival, all Jesuit missionaries get banned. Then 3 years later, Christianity gets banned. All right, the religion as a whole. Okay, so the Jesuits who remained, or the Japanese who had accepted Catholicism from the Jesuits become known as underground Catholics. All right. And so these missionaries, they start slaughtering them because they feel like they're trying to undo Japanese culture. And so that's why it was so dangerous, and that's what happens after they get banned. But they still try to eventually, what do you call it, convert them. Well, near the end of the Tokugawa rule, okay, the United States comes along and changes everything up for Japan. So Commodore Matthew Perry, all right, and this is not the guy who played Chandler and Friends, but this guy does have a very important tie to another famous figure in American history. So Commodore Matthew Perry, okay, he's from the U.S. In 1853, he arrives in Japan with his naval fleet, okay. These boats were called the Black Ships because of their dark black iron that was used to build them. He brings to the Japanese a letter from President Millard Fillmore, telling the Japanese that they need to open up trade with the United States. They need to start having diplomatic relations, start buying from us, yada yada. Japan doesn't want to do this. So Matthew Perry is going to rely on what is known as gunboat diplomacy. Essentially, he takes these nice industrialized guns or these ships, and he aims the guns at Japan and says, "Listen, you're going to trade with us. You're going to do what this letter says, or we're going to go to war with you." And I feel like you know the odds are not at all in your favor. So through sheer force, the United States forces Japan to open up relationships with the United States. Okay, so this is kind of leads to the end of the Great Peace. In 1868 begins what is known as the Meiji Restoration. Okay, so it's a period where Japan begins to embrace Western changes. There's a great movie that covers this. If you've ever seen The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, it does a perfect job explaining or showing the old Japanese culture, what they wanted to hold on to, and what it was like with these new Western changes and how it takes it apart and kind of the different political dynamics there. It's one of my favorite movies, and I'm not a Tom Cruise fan. It's awesome. Okay, so the Meiji Restoration. So Japan realizes it needs to be strong enough to compete with the West. Okay, it wanted to be up there with Britain and Prussia at the time, and the United States. It wanted to be a world power. Okay, so they know to do that they need to modernize their military and invest in industrialization. So the Industrial Revolution had just kind of been kicked off and started spreading across the globe. They know they need factories. They need this to increase their strengthen their economy, to strengthen their infrastructure, and to strengthen their military so they can compete with the rest of the world. Okay, so they do all the things that China had refused to do, and you'll see their relationship with European nations in America is a lot better than that of China. Okay. This also during this time period is going to strengthen the power of the emperor. Instead of him just being more of a religious figurehead, he is going to become more of a political leader, and it's going to weaken the power of the shogun. All right. And in all these changes, they're going to change their government. Okay, so the Japanese are going to adopt a government very similar to what the Germans had at that time. Okay, so it's a constitution, but it has an emperor. All right, so kind of like a constitutional monarchy. The whole reason they do this, though, is not that they believed in democracy or anything like that, but they knew they needed to do that to unite Japan, to get all the people behind this new changing government. All right, so it's a very interesting time period, all that changes in Japan, but they do try to westernize, and that's going to give them the head up over the rest of Asia. Okay, so now they take this new government, the stronger, modernized industrial army, and they're going to start to conquer, all right, some of the other powers of Asia. Now, this is going to kind of set the stage. They're going to continue to do that. All right, they play a decent role in World War One. And then they've kind of had that foundation put in place after World War One, where they want to conquer the whole continent, the whole Pacific Ocean. They started doing so with Korea, Manchuria, try to with the Philippines and Australia, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This sets the stage for the Japan that we see in World War II. Okay, this is when you kind of get the idea of what that country's going to be like. But it all starts in 1894 with the first Sino-Japanese War. Sino means Chinese, okay? So even though Japan knew it had this large industrialized army, the rest of the world really wasn't expecting them to do much with it. China's army was still larger, and everyone expected the Chinese to win. But Japan takes this new industrialized army and better equipment, and is going to lead to a very surprising victory. As a result of the First Sino-Japanese War, They take control of Taiwan. Okay, they claim that and the Pescadores Islands as colonies for themselves from China. Okay, so they're doing what the Europeans were doing as well. They're trying to take over their land. That's why they got involved in the Boxer Rebellion because they could use that to gain more influence over there. They also are going to is going to lead to the independence of Korea from China. Now, Japan will eventually conquer Korea, but that little peninsula is now no longer under Chinese control. Then, about a decade after that, they go to war with Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, Russia is technically a European nation, even though now everyone kind of realized they need to expect more out of Japan. Russia's still, Europe's still going to keep the butt of Asia, they thought, okay? And the two countries are trying to compete for control of Korea, which was nearly independent, and Manchuria, which is the northern chunk of China. All right, so Russia shares a border with Manchuria. Japan is wanting to go from Korea and then further west and take over Manchuria so they can get some mainland Asian control. It'd be like if Great Britain was trying to take over the Netherlands and then the northern half of France or something like that. Well, Russia expects a big win. Now, Russia, the best part of its army, was over there in Europe because that's where it felt like most of its potential threats were. So why worry about Asia when you've got Europe to handle? So they had the Baltic Fleet, and this is the pride of the Russian Navy. Okay, this is what they bragged about. This is what they expected to go into any battle and win. Well, they got to take this Baltic Fleet all the way from Northern Europe, sail it around Africa, all right, because they don't have control of the Suez Canal, Britain does, and eventually make their way to Japan, and they're going to use that to crush this Japanese Navy. Well, they get there, and they're caught off guard in a ambush, and the Japanese completely decimate the Baltic Fleet. All right, destroy it, leaves very little left, and now the Russians realize, oh crap, we're kind of screwed here. Well, Japan, like I said, quick, sudden victories, but now they're starting to run out of supplies. Yes, they'd industrialized, but they didn't have the kind of stockpiles that everyone else in the world did. So Russia, all they've got to do is outlast them. But the problem for the Russians is the people of Russia are already embarrassed by being in this position, and they've got their own economic and social struggles back home. The Russian people are fed up, and they want this war to be done with. They now don't care about winning; they just want it over. They're furious with their czar, so that forces Czar Alexander to sue for peace. Okay, so this actually brings in Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, he's brought in to negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth. The leaders for Russia, Japan, and then President Roosevelt actually negotiate this treaty aboard the presidential yacht. So this is before Air Force One. The airplane's like a 3-year-old invention, but it's pretty cool. He used to have a presidential yacht. So Roosevelt negotiates the treaty between them. Okay, Russia gives back Manchuria. Okay, so they give up control of that. Japan gets control of Korea. There's a few more things with different islands between the two of them, but this is real important because this is the first time in 200 years. Okay, so this would be since the early 1700s, late 1600s, that a European nation had been defeated by any Asian nation. Okay, so this is one of the big upsets on the global stage. It's a huge embarrassment for the Russians, and it's more ammunition for the communists who eventually will try to overthrow it in 1917. But this shows the world that Japan is ready to play and not to be messed with. So that's it for Asia. That's kind of our main, our last video. Only going to talk about China and Japan in regards to that. Next video we should have up, like I said, Tuesday, maybe Wednesday. And this will be about World War I for your package. So if you have any questions, like I said, comment, email, or message through our mind. But hope this helps. Y'all take care.